If you walk around Toronto, chances are you'll run into some pretty cool street art. Appealing street art seems to be a shared feature of hip urban cities, from Toronto to LA to New York City. When I visited Berlin this past May, I was so excited to see the city arguably most known for street art and leftist punk spirit. When the Berlin Wall fell, Berliners relished in the spatial freedom and mobility that was once lost. To reclaim their city and exercise spatial freedom, Berliners were putting graffiti everywhere. Graffiti on trains, on bridges, bathrooms are covered with "Death to Fascism" stickers. Having the agency to use their city's space the way they wanted was valuable. So when I came across an Uber venue right next to the famous East Side Gallery, it probably would have made a punk Berliner in the 80s puke. As I explored more of Berlin, it was becoming apparent that as the city grew and became more attractive to foreign investors, the government began to co-opt street art for commercial purposes. Formally, Berlin has strict laws against graffiti, claiming that they may even imprison graffiti artists for 2 years. But in practice, it's well known by artists that these laws are rarely taken seriously because graffiti is seen as essential to the urban culture Berlin sells for profit and uses to craft a punk city brand. Once a symbol of counterculture, street art and graffiti can now be used to promote luxury brands or big corporations, attract tourists like myself, and increase the cost of housing in certain hip and alternative areas. Ironically, this drove out local artists who could no longer afford to live in so-called artsy areas.
The East Side Gallery is on prime real estate with a view of the river. That's made it very attractive to developers.
On my trip, I learned that local Berlin artists don't even like the East Side Gallery. It's considered a shallow, apolitical piece of art that's commissioned by the government for tourism. And government-controlled it is. When some of the artists on the East Side Gallery refused to touch up their murals in 2008, the government simply covered up their work.
Diese East Side Galerie, wie sie jetzt ist für mich eine wahnsinnige, sauteure und immer wieder ein scheiternder Versuch, eine Leiche wiederzubeleben.
When I came back to Toronto, I started noticing lots of similarities in the development of street art here. I walked all over Toronto paying close attention to street art, from large professional murals to tags and scrawled messages on concrete walls. How did street art become so mainstream?
I've done
Graffiti writing in New York is a vocation. Its traditions are handed down from one youthful generation to the next. To some, it's art. To most people, however, it is a plague that never ends. A symbol that we've lost control.
When we talk about street art, there's debate around how to define the term. For our purposes, we will be talking about contemporary street art, which comes from what is classified as hip-hop graffiti, a kind of writing that emerged in the post-civil rights era of the United States, pioneered by mostly African-American and Latino youth living in Philadelphia and the Bronx in the mid-1960s. For most of history, graffiti referred to things like cave paintings and hieroglyphics, scratches or drawings on a surface. But because of hip-hop graffiti, graffiti is now associated with aerosol on freight trains, gang tags, and declarations of love on bathroom stalls. A lot of street art has since taken hip-hop graffiti and merged it with fine art techniques so that it sits between lowbrow and highbrow art.
I got into street art. I was originally a fine artist. I trained at OCAD, which is only a few blocks away from here, as a fine artist. I really wasn't even really aware of street art to begin with. And I started doing these commercial murals. And for many, many years, I made a strong mental distinction between my own personal work, which I showed in galleries, and the commercial art that I was being paid to do. And now I don't really make that much of a distinction. There's a little bit of that kind of outlaw, transgressive aspect to street art, which was once there in fine art, and I don't really feel is there that much anymore, to be honest. I'd make the distinction between tagging and graffiti and then street art. It seems like graffiti is sort of its own art form, and then what I'm doing here is more of a kind of a mural art. But tagging, as far as I know, at least in Toronto, seems to be a kind of a territorial urban game where someone will do a tag and then someone will over-tag it, something like that. In America, in the bigger cities, is sort of associated with gang activity. It's a way of sort of retaking public space.
So the definition of contemporary street art is significantly related to graffiti and politics. For those who think graffiti is a form of art, street art will be an umbrella category that encompasses more specific forms of street art, such as installations, murals, and graffiti. Other times, street art is used to refer only to clean and polished urban art to separate it from graffiti, to emphasize that the former counts as art and the latter is unwanted vandalism.
They don't have anything better to do. If you like art, then go to art school and become an artist.
Thus, to understand what street art means today, it's important to understand the cultural and political significance of graffiti. If a big city currently promotes their thriving street art culture, chances are that city has tried to shut down that art before. When contemporary street art began hitting urban cities in the 1970s, elites and politicians were real ticked off, to say the least. They did not like seeing people treat public or corporate property as their own sketchbook.
I'm Detective Bernie Jacobs. I, in conjunction with my partner, Detective Jim McHugh, are the crime prevention coordinators for the New York City Transit Police Department. I will show you graffiti, such as the letters on the end of that car directly in back of me. Is that an art form? I don't know. I'm not an art critic. But I can sure as hell tell you that that's a crime.
Graffiti culture directly challenged capitalism's top-down style of control. Street artists refused to be passive consumers or spectators of their own city. They wanted to play an active role in negotiating their collective identity as members of a certain space. The wall of a house is a space that belongs to the eyes of the person looking at it. In this sense, it's a public space. When we stick up that particular poem on that particular house, we're not thinking of who's living there, who probably will never read that poem, because he lives behind it. We're interested in those who will see it with their eyes. The architectural phenotypes of the streets, house facades, are public property. So why are they private property? In the 80s and 90s, policing became heavily influenced by the broken windows theory, proposed by James Q. Wilson and George Kelling in 1982. The theory claimed that visible signs of disorder would lead to serious acts of crime. By seeing a broken window, it makes people more inclined to commit violent robberies themselves. Under broken windows policing then, cops were encouraged to treat minor property crime like petty vandalism as a gateway to violent crime. This meant that there wasn't a huge difference between street art and graffiti at the time, because the police and government hated them both. What they cared about was keeping the walls of their precious property clean. They didn't care if it was a mural or a graffiti tag. New York City had a particularly tough crackdown on graffiti. This is really funny because now hip NYC neighborhoods with street art have seen its property prices increase by 10 to 15%. In 1995, Giuliani established the Anti-Graffiti Task Force to increase law enforcement around graffiti, and in 1999, his office helped lead an effort known as Graffiti Free NYC. It allowed property owners to report illegal street art via a city hotline or fill out a Forever Graffiti Free form to give the city consent to clean their property.
Some people think vandalizing TA property is fun. Some people think vandalizing TA property is art. Some people think vandalizing TA property is costly. Vandalizing TA property is illegal.
Now, I can't ignore the racial relations this was situated in. Remember how when the Berlin Wall fell, Berliners used graffiti to reclaim space and exercise their spatial freedom? Well, the 60s and 70s were politically charged times for America. Racial segregation had just been recently outlawed, Western capitalism was facing widespread opposition, second-wave feminism was gaining strength, tons of new migrants were entering America, marginalized voices were growing louder and were seeking expression through street art. Since marginalized groups faced systemic barriers to holding positions of power, they took their counterculture messages to streets and walls. Graffiti was a way of rejecting a top-down society where a select group at the top held all the authority. Instead, the people on the ground wanted their voices heard and wanted to leave their mark on their community. Graffiti became a form of political, often leftist expression. Because a decent chunk of street artists were black or brown folk or were poor, when the police began cracking down on graffiti, it only contributed to the rapidly growing race and class disparities in jail. You know, it's helpful to note that this war on graffiti took place during the same period as the war on drugs, where racialized individuals, often black, were deliberately over-policed, arrested, and charged with more severe consequences than their white counterparts. Graffiti was once a countercultural threat that conservative forces roundedly maligned as a racially coded stand-in for urban delinquency. At this point, someone might go, well, gangs do graffiti, and gangs are violent and dangerous, so graffiti is a good indicator of violent crime. Actually, the correlation between graffiti and violence has been studied a lot, and there is no statistical evidence that simply having graffiti in a neighborhood, including gang graffiti, causes more violence. But even if that were true, most of the graffiti in a city are not gang tags. And even if we only focus on tagging, where was the evidence that most tags belong to gangs? If they were done by gangs, why does the majority of graffitis concentrate around art schools and hipster districts? In the 1990s, as more college-educated students moved from the suburbs to the city, many of them deliberately lived around graffiti-heavy neighborhoods because that was the authentic urban vibe. There have been many incidents in the government and police, including high-ranked agencies like the LAPD or FBI, where they mistakenly use photos of hip-hop style tags on their website or reports and mislabel them as gang graffiti. It's embarrassing how bad they are at their job.
I'm a muralist, I'm an artist, like this is my entrepreneurship, this is my life. You know, and they stopped that day from me, man.
Detroit well-known muralist Chiefy McFly overcome with emotions after he was cuffed and arrested by 2 police officers while working on a project commissioned by the city. McFly says he was racially profiled.
It's worth making a side note here that graffiti is not just a contemporary phenomenon. It's been around since the ancient times. A comparison of how ancient European graffiti is treated versus modern hip-hop graffiti brings out the racist undertones in current opinions. Several historians note that when ancient Greek, Roman, or Coptic tourists visited Egyptian sites and left graffiti on Egyptian buildings, the graffiti was preserved and studied as valuable historical artifacts. Today, the 19th century graffiti written by Lord Byron on the classical Greek temple of Poseidon in Athens is considered a tourist attraction. However, in 2013, when a Chinese tourist wrote his name on an Egyptian temple at Luxor, news outlets were pressed, and social media ripped him to shreds for ruining the monument. A lot of the media coverage used negative ethnic stereotypes, portraying Chinese people as uncivilized and lacking quality and breeding, as if Western tourists never engaged in such behavior. Why are ancient graffiti preserved and studied, but their modern equivalents at ancient sites erased and vilified? Something to think about. Huge skyscrapers and condos everywhere, luxury stores left and right, super expensive bougie restaurants. Now, Toronto's government has had a shorter but also passionate feud with graffiti. A neighborhood called Yorkville used to be the center of the art scene. Can you believe this used to be the art scene of Toronto? Clearly something has changed. Well, when the city built the Bloor-Danforth subway line, or Line 2 as most people now call it, the neighborhood's property costs started to increase and graffiti started to no longer be compatible with the more wealthy aesthetic of the neighborhood. Artists can no longer afford to live here, so they migrated towards Queen Street West. Then, as Queen Street West got gentrified, the art scene moved even further east to Riverdale and Regent Park. You may know Rob Ford, our previous mayor from his cocaine days. Well, his brother, Doug Ford, is our current premier of Ontario, and I'm not so fond of his Thanos-looking ass either.
Move forward, but not coming from the government per se, but the premier. It's coming from the health sector. Holy Christ.
Now, Rob Ford declared a war on graffiti and spent $400,000 in 1 year to get rid of street art because it didn't match his aesthetic. Rob Ford is a clean girl. He can't handle looking too alt or grungy. With anti-graffiti policies like these, graffiti artists were historically anonymous. They weren't making money off of their craft, at least not legally or stably, and they expected their art to be temporary. A mural could last a week before law enforcement or businesses would cover it up. It could last only a few hours. Street art required spontaneity. Since graffiti artists had to be vigilant about not being caught by the police, they had to be ready to flee from their art at any moment. Interestingly then, the concept of being finished was not as important to a lot of street art. Unlike traditional artwork, such as paintings and sculptures, preservation was not the goal. Instead, street art aimed to be integrated with everyday life. Sometimes they get covered up by trees or branches as the seasons change. Icicles might freeze on top of the graffiti, creating new texture. Rain might change the paint colors. A mural feels different depending on whether there are lots of people walking by or only one person. Street art is living art.
Guys, I have something to confess. I'm a Microsoft Edge user, which means I sometimes look at Bing for news. I know, it's the literal beta of web browsers, but I used it once and I'm a loyal gal. I consider myself an edger. But it's definitely not the best place to get my news. History made at US box office over Thanksgiving weekend. 2019 Trump greets Justin Trudeau at the White House. Do whatever you want in this Game of Thrones game. It was time I switched to something else. How convenient that the sponsor of this video is Ground News. Ground News is an app and website that gathers related articles from more than 50,000 sources across the world and political spectrum in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. They've got way more specific topics you can follow than your ordinary news source. For example, I followed gentrification for this video, and I found this story on Chinatown activists in Philadelphia. You can see that there have been 30 outlets that reported on this story, and all of them can be accessed within Ground News. Then if you check under the bias distribution heading, you can see 24% of the sources lean left and 76% lean center. So let's compare a left and center headline. The left-leaning headline reads, "In Philadelphia, Chinatown activists rally again to stop development." This time, it's a 76ers arena. The center headline reads, "Philadelphia's Chinatown rallies against development of new 76ers arena." The difference is very small, but you can see one headline explicitly mention activists being the ones rallying, whereas the other vaguely mentions Chinatown as a whole. This headline also says they are rallying again, telling us gentrification is a repeated concern, while the other headline makes the rally sound like an isolated event. Having Ground News compile all these sources in one place has been super helpful for checking bias and practicing media literacy skills, and you should too. Visit ground.news/AliSunvia or scan my QR code to subscribe today. You can sign up now to get 40% off the same Vantage plan I use. That's ground.news/AliSunvia or scan the QR code, wherever it is on screen.
If we want to talk in art terms for a second, graffiti is low-key postmodern. Modernism was like, yeah, art and life are separate. Artistic significance is just in a work's aesthetic and formal properties. Stop trying to dissect the art for political messages or metaphors or social representation. Modernism was the OG, it's not that deep, bro. Then pop artists like Andy Warhol came along and were like, look at these boxes, now look at these other boxes. Why do my boxes belong in a museum as art, but those ones don't? Boom, artistic significance is not just aesthetic and formal properties. Hashtag art is life. So pop art was postmodern by allowing everyday objects and events to enter museums, galleries, and art critic discourse. But street art flipped this around. Street art was postmodern by letting the art enter everyday life. Street art challenged everything about the art world. Art goes into museums and galleries to be preserved, but street artists gave up any private ownership of their work. Once they put it on a street, it belonged to the world. Most street art is erased by nature or interfered with by other people, and those everyday interactions are all part of the art. Museums place great importance on finding the origin of a work of art. Street art is anonymous and thus fights against constructing grand narratives. The art world is home to rich elites, whereas street artists are thinking about community members and everyday passerbys. Art became a surprise rather than an object we intentionally seek out in some gallery. Street art surprises us out of our passive spectator role and lets us actively engage with our surroundings. Street art had always been the exact opposite to private property. It was okay that the art might be short-lived because it belonged to the public and natural world. However, as the law continued to chase down street artists, street art culture became harder to sustain. Thus, to preserve their ways of art, artists began to do street art differently. To avoid being chased down by police officers, some artists arranged agreements with property owners who would let them use their property as a canvas. During this time, businesses also became more willing to have street art on their buildings because commercial advertising began using billboards and posters, which look similar to street art.
Hey! It's not open. This is me.
Yours, right?
Yeah.
Ooh. I was reading research and actually people were writing about how contemporary street art seemed to foreshadow modern advertising.
Yeah.
Just having these big pictures and text everywhere on the streets, on our buildings.
Yeah.
And so advertising really copied street art in a lot of ways.
That's so true. Yeah.
It's kind of hard to put any political messaging into street art. Do you find that to be true, or do you not really have experience with that?
It can be true because you're commissioned by the people who doesn't want to see like certain images or certain propaganda.
Do you think street art is able to like maintain, you know, the same kind of essence and goals it had before, or?
I don't know. I don't know if it's natural. I think it may be inevitable. I think it's part of like a larger trends in culture where urban culture absorbed into these kinds of corporate values. I remember one street artist. I'm not gonna be able to quote him by name, but he said, it's like it's not like we're being force-fed all this visual information, all this corporate branding and stuff. In the end, there's always going to be a lot more corporate imagery than there ever is street art anyway.
To ensure that the street artist would not hurt the property owner's business or reputation, artists often had to dial back on the rebellious, grungy nature of their style and also avoid political messages. The art form metamorphosized, with graffiti, once known for its hurried, look-over-your-shoulder throw-ups, merging with a nascent genre of street art, the less nefarious mural. These less nefarious murals are all over Toronto now, thanks to the START program the city launched in 2012. It may seem like a total 180 from Toronto's previous anti-graffiti approach, but honestly, it's just the same goals, but hidden underneath an if you can't beat 'em, join 'em mindset. According to the START program website, one of the primary goals is still to get rid of graffiti, but instead of getting rid of street art as a whole, they'll support good street art projects that make a positive impact on the community and get rid of the bad ones. So I gotta ask, what does good street art mean? Well, now that street artists are more reliant on property owners, good largely means abiding by private property interests and being apolitical. The government also talks about improving the city's well-being and promoting positive feelings of community, though it's not clear to me why we only get these effects if the government regulates street art. Oh wait, it's because they care about certain community members at the expense of others. To be fair, the government probably had good liberal intentions to make everyone happy, but that sort of makes them like HR saying, why can't we all just get along? I know you're upset that you still need to rely on food banks and that we're giving more funding to the police than education, but you can discuss those problems at home or call us even though we'll never answer the phone. Just try not to express those problems outside. When other people see it, it's gonna make them feel bad. There was one street artist I reached out to who did not want to be interviewed because they believed that voicing their true opinions could cost them their job. I don't know if I want to put my real opinions out there, as it could negatively impact my chances of getting funding. Off the record, I feel like the city of Toronto has drained street art of almost all potential value in the ways other big cities have not. Doug Ford apparently gets paid by the graffiti removal people. It's all a sick game. I wish there were better ways for artists to survive, but unfortunately, I have to play this game like every other artist. Government monopolizes the process and sanitizes the art so it's safe, lacks meaning, lacks political advocacy, makes it an administrative game of bylaws and grant applications. One of the few places in Toronto where graffiti is legal is Graffiti Alley, which is unsurprisingly also a tourist attraction. Businesses don't have to worry about getting vandalized because graffiti artists now have this designated area to play along with. W's across the board, am I right, chat? Perhaps some W's, but this is a huge transformation of how contemporary street art has functioned. Graffiti is not supposed to have physical boundaries nor aim at preservation. Graffiti is supposed to integrate art into the world in that postmodern way. But now this alley is basically an outdoor museum. That many writers have begun to see themselves and their art form as legitimate participants within the public square can be seen in changes in their vocabulary, and when asked what kind of place in society they would like to see writing culture occupy. In the 1970s and 1980s, writers would describe their painting expeditions as bombing, hitting, or killing. In the 1990s, with the transition to legal walls, writers now got together to paint. Do you find that the street art culture or graffiti culture has changed a lot from when you used to do it and then post-COVID?
So it's become more accepted, I think. Like, a lot more people want to have art on their business or their garage. Sort of become a bit of a trendy thing, in thanks to like parts of government that have really gone out of their way to like popularize it. I'm frightful for the future of street art. I feel like there's a lot of white kids from Richmond Hill bomb on like murals of OGs being put in work for like several decades. Bombing is like, so basically you're going around, it doesn't necessarily is indicative of like wrecking someone's mural, but basically you're just going around and lighting up walls with paint. So your stuff is never safe, and that's why a lot of artists try to get interior murals because it protects it more. But I think that begins to take away from the fact that it's street art. It's now become an installation because it's inside. I've done a lot of interior murals. I like them more personally for working, but that's not really what it's rooted in, and that's outside painting on walls. So like it loses its authenticity.
It sanitizes graffiti into a neat exhibition where everything is clumped together. The art pieces lose any community and spatial context and becomes individual pieces for spectating. There's a reason why so many street artists strongly oppose putting their work into museums. Street art cannot be separated from their environment, or else they are no longer street art. It's sort of in the name.
You're not just painting the wall, like it also changed the vibe and changed the narrative of the street. So it can change a lot of things. Like usually, like if I do small paintings, people have to come to my show and come inside of the gallery and see the artwork, but street art is just there.
The other thing that I noticed through doing the work and through talking to the street artists was that there was a whole audience for art that would never set foot in a gallery, that thought galleries were boring. They would tell me with no irony, "I love art, dude. I love art." And then if I talk to them about any kind of historical art or anything like that, it's like, oh, no. It's this. I do think that by bringing street art into museums, it is neutered a little bit, and I do think the aesthetics of it change. And I do think it becomes a kind of a fetish that gives a little bit more credibility and street credibility to these institutions that are increasingly alienated from their younger audience.
We're all struggling out here. If you pop all of a sudden and you're able to put your work in a gallery, by all means you should do that. But I feel like if it becomes more and more popular, like it was when graffiti first became popularized in like the early 90s, when guys were just doing like burners on a canvas and selling them for like $50,000, like that, I think turns it into something that it's not really rooted in, which is rebellion and expression. That's more like commercialization of something. Like, we're all trying to get money, we're trying to survive, so like, big up if you actually do that. If you get your stuff, you get installations, like I've been in some galleries, my canvas work, coffee shops. That's rad, but like, you want to stay rooted outside.
You'll also find lots of graffiti in Kensington Market. Historically a community known for its immigrant enclaves, it's now a pretty popular shop and eat destination for tourists because of its quirky, grungy aesthetic. There are lots of vintage shops and restaurants here sprayed with graffiti art, which feels quite ironic. Graffiti, once undesirable and unprofitable, now attracts people to buy $80 jeans and take Instagram photos. Street art used to disrupt the capitalist colonization of space, but now it can be used to support it. Gentrification and financialization is a huge concern for residents of Kensington Market, which has led to the formation of organizations like the Kensington Market Community Land Trust.
So the Kensington Market Community Land Trust is a community-based nonprofit organization. Our big picture mandate is to acquire and own property for the benefit of the community. So what that means is owning it, taking it outside of the speculative real estate market so that the benefits of owning that property stay in the community forever, with the long-term goal of residential space and commercial space affordable in the community and preserving the kind of mixed-use, multi-ethnic, diverse characteristics that make Kensington a really unique community.
Okay. And why has Kensington been such a target of gentrification?
Why is that happening? I mean, in the way that capitalism always needs to be expanding its markets? Well, it's a funky neighborhood, which in a previous generation was kind of like a down-and-out place for people like me, artists, and people who don't quite fit in, sort of find places on the edge to do what we do. But that then becomes attractive, and then more and more people want to be around that. It becomes a tourist destination. It becomes a place where people want to set up a funky bar or a restaurant, and so a place that used to sell fresh food or was a butcher then becomes a bar or a cannabis shop, or a place that was, you know, low-cost, affordable place to live becomes what we call a ghost hotel. It becomes run under Airbnb. So in some ways, the things that made Kensington unique and attractive are therefore the things that then become places where capitalism's expanding markets move in, and, you know, what traditionally is called gentrification starts to happen. I think what we should be calling the further financialization of real estate.
Do you think there are ways in which street artists can prevent their subculture from being co-opted by, like, mainstream commodification of street art?
Well, I mean, my first answer would be to work with organizations like ours. We're doing a lot of work on that building, that first building that we bought at 54 Kensington Avenue, the Mona Lisa building. First of all, the Mona Lisa mural itself is pretty old and deteriorating, and we may, for environmental reasons, want to put a cladding on the exterior of the building, which would cover up the existing mural. So we've got in touch with the artist who originally did that, who now lives on the East Coast, and have managed to put some funding together and are planning to bring him back to the neighborhood. And I'm really excited about that. That's an example of street art or public art in this neighborhood that I think, you know, reflects the neighborhood, reflects who we are, and it enables us to work with an artist and actually find money to pay that artist, and to do it in conjunction with a really solidly community-based effort where, again, the benefits of that work are staying in the community. I'm really excited by the model, and I want to expand that model to not only be about owning property for cheap rent, but also to keep the neighborhood, you know, that funky, inclusive, diverse, arts-based kind of community that Kensington has been for generations and generations.
Organizations like the KMCLT are finding ways to pay artists without commodifying their art or their community. As a local nonprofit organization, they are directly preserving the community's character through street art. Beautification projects enhance the community's character. But that may not always be the case. For example, it is far less clear whether the beautification projects on the wall in the West Bank are appropriate or not. The Palestinian side is filled with a disorderly array of street art and graffiti in an attempt to minimize the behemoth wall's stark, gray appearance looming on this landscape. Sections of the side visible to Israelis are adorned with colorful pastoral scenes of meadows, trees, and blue sky. Parts of the wall in Jerusalem are painted in soft pastels, depicting a viaduct bordered by lush green fields and a vibrant blue sky. These aesthetic devices are conscious attempts to disguise walled separation and the harsh reality of a scarred terrain. I have heard Palestinians Particularly older people insist that artists stop trying to beautify the wall. Some Palestinians think graffiti minimizes the seriousness of the wall. The Palestinian artist Aid Arafa says, "I won't touch the wall with colors. It's an act of normalization or beautification. People come here now as though they are visiting the pyramids in Egypt, like they are visiting a tourist attraction."
It's much different. I think that the children now are of a different class and they've lost touch with hip-hop culture. So like I apply the tenets of honor, respect, skill, hard work to what I do. It's important to show them a way of conducting yourself and respecting other art and being like knowing that you're part of a community of other artists. A lot of them come from privileged families. They haven't struggled, and their whole thing is to destroy and create problems because they've never experienced problems or hardship.
I mean, there are rules, but I mean, the rules do apparently get suspended. And I've had, you know, young guys come right up to me and go like, "I'm going to tag your mural on the weekend," and they did. I know that, you know, people are, you know, the audience is looking at it, you know, with their own frame of reference too. And I know that the property owners certainly see what I do as being totally different from, you know, someone who would put a throw up on their wall overnight. These murals are made in consultation with a client, so they do have a lot of input into it. Maybe that makes a difference, although I have to say that with this mural, the first draft, it was a digital drawing that I presented to them, was accepted. They had very little input into it, actually.
There's an artist, I think she's from Denver, Lauren Y.S., big into LGBTQ community. She wants to have their voice heard through her art. So some of her work is like very political. Okay. But she kind of make it look very artistic and poetic and kind of hide those messages in her like designs, like very intricate designs. So I think that's a very clever way to do it.
Ultimately, street art is certainly changing a lot, and the divide is widening between urban street artists who draw murals versus graffiti artists. The authentic, provocative messages that street artists used to make are often co-opted by a commodified aesthetic of leftist politics. It's now often hard to tell, just from looking, when an aesthetic is authentic and when it's plainly a visual aesthetic, used to serve capitalist goals and spatial arrangements. When I was in Berlin, the marketing of its alternative aesthetic put squats and house projects in a bind. Alexander Vasudovin, who conducted an in-depth study of the history and ethnography of the Berlin squatting scene, comments, whilst the continued existence of alternative housing projects represented an opportunity to experiment with radical forms of shared living and working, it also reminded squatters that their survival stemmed in no small part from the cultural capital they conferred on an increasingly neoliberal city. And I was one of those tourists who cashed in on their cultural capital. Squats and house projects are easily co-opted because they have such a unique and artistic look. They are, for instance, the focal points for many alternative walking and cycling tours run by guides. Explicit anti-capitalist signage and messaging seems like it should be less easy to co-opt. But since everyone in Berlin is used to seeing anti-capitalist, anti-authoritarian content exist side by side with trendy boutiques, high-end restaurants, and expensive housing, its potential for conveying genuinely transgressive or resistant messaging is dampened. Street artists are now also caught in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. It's difficult for artists who are trying to disrupt and claim commodified, marketized spaces to not accidentally become complicit in this commercialization and commodification. So what are street artists supposed to do? Many thinkers see graffiti and street art as additions to space, which overlay it and decorate or disfigure it. But in Quill R. Kukla's paper, Street Art, Placemaking, and Anti-Capitalist Spatial Activism, she argues that the role of street art is not additive but transformative. Street art can be a substantial intervention into place identity. It can be a restructuring force that changes how a space is legible or interpretable to its users, as well as how that space forms a territory with insiders and outsiders. Let's break that down. There are 3 distinct ways in which street art can resist capitalist colonization of space. I'm not finished. Okay. First, it can have explicit messaging or political content. This content can give meaning to a space and can hint at what sorts of practices and people belong or don't belong. For instance, because graffiti culture rejects top-down control of space, artists tend to express anti-capitalist, anti-authoritarian, anti-establishment content. It's likely that you'll see ACAB written around the city or Free Palestine. However, because street art is so strongly tied to private property interests now, there's a lot of apolitical street art, because voicing countercultural stances are seen as bad for business. As a result, unclaimed spaces and abandoned properties have become the central site of street art with explicit political content. I often see the most political street art on bridges or under bridges. I also always find graffiti sprayed on city notice boards where they are constructing yet another condo, or for lease signs where a local business is being replaced by a franchise. These are ways for community members to express disapproval of changes being made to their space. Second, street art resists capitalist colonization of space by changing how we move through spaces and what we pay attention to. In Quill Kukla's fancy terms, it's thereby shaping the phenomenological form and temporality of space. When companies are doing their developing, they tend to focus on certain areas, creating hubs for businesses, and then ignore other areas, making them spaces to just pass through. Street artists can challenge this capitalist neglect of space because they often mark spaces that people don't pay attention to, such as underpasses, ceilings, alleyways, and garage doors. Phenomenology fan? For example, when I visited a farmer's market under an underpass this summer, I was expecting the plain concrete you usually see under a bridge. Instead, I was met with amazing murals. But if this underpass was taken out of this lively farmer's market and put into a museum, it would lose the essence of street art. I would not be surprised out of my passivity. I would not see the murals come to life from all the families sitting around and music playing in the air. In a museum, the murals would reinforce our passive role as viewers rather than be art that we actively shape our lives around. Street art can shift how we direct our attention as we move through a space, which can in turn radically alter its perceived form. It can also change our movement through a space as we move close to and linger by a small piece, for instance. We may be caught off guard by an interesting drawing on a wall that we were just intending to brush past and end up slowing down to take a closer look. So street art draws upon us to pay attention to spaces that capitalism has deemed not useful or not profitable and gives them new meaning. Business developers and city planners design spaces in line with neoliberal interests, but street art alters that spatial and temporal form through a bottom-up process. Thus, street art can be used to disrupt a city's attempt to control its look and to curate a certain aesthetic for tourists. Lastly, street art can be a tool of spatial secession, which means it can be used to visually signal that a space has intentionally separated itself from the rest of the landscape. Street art helps turn spaces into specific territories in which some people belong and others do not. For example, squats and house projects in Berlin that are explicitly anti-capitalist often use fences, walls, and gates to enclose themselves. The residents of these spaces often do not want to draw attention to themselves because they do not want their alternative grunge look to become part of Berlin's tourist attraction and hence to be commodified. These fences, walls, and gates, as well as spray-painted words, are not just physical barriers, but also phenomenologically bar outsiders. These visual signs intentionally signal that outsiders are not welcome. Thus, even though someone could technically open the gate or climb over the fence, the graffiti still creates a spatial experience that only certain people can have. Street art is a collective public good, and I want to defend the value of a huge variety of street art, ranging from huge colorful murals to the random writing and doodles on walls. Especially in Toronto, where houses are getting less and less affordable, it gets harder and harder to find a studio to create art in. But street art doesn't require a studio. It is out there on public space. But it is getting harder and harder to find street art that is truly a public good. The street art is still publicly accessible in spaces for free. You can't not see a huge mural unless you're visually impaired in some way. However, the public no longer has shared ownership over this space. Instead, it is private property owners who decide who can use this wall and who cannot. They use bureaucratic application processes to decide whether your piece of art is good or whether it is vandalism that should be covered up. I do want to acknowledge, though, that for small local businesses, graffiti can be a pain and be considered property damage, especially when graffiti is used to target immigrants.
Hi, Kim. It was nice to meet you today. So, I was just wondering what your business is and how long you've been here for.
I'm in this area 30 years as a hair salon.
And where did the mural on your building came from?
That's last year. It's so messy. Every day they write something, drawing something, so that's why I cannot stand for that. This guy suggests, okay, if he draw something, the painting, and then they won't do that, so that's why I did.
So he approached you. He came up to you.
We are neighbors, we know each other.
I want to say that I love Kim very much. She's a really awesome woman. I've known her a long time.
He said there are rules among graffiti guys, and then he drew something and then leave a sign, his sign, and then they don't touch.
What didn't you like about the graffiti that people were leaving before?
They don't have any rules, and then there is no gap. Every corner he wrote something, every day different guy. That's so messy.
Now the government actually pays people money to draw street art over the city. And so do you support the spread of street art in Toronto, or are you against it as a business owner?
I will support because of if not, then it's so messy and dirty everywhere in this area too. So if artists to do that, and then it will be beautiful.
The commodification and commercialization of street art has put artists in a tricky spot. But at the same time, culture is made up of and sustained by its participants. Without artists, there is no art. And for all the criticism street artists get for being sellouts when they work for commissioned murals, it's probably nice that they can make a decent living off of their art and have the financial means to continue it. Probably better than having to run from the police. Now, of course, what would a YouTube video essay be without mentioning how evil your darn phone are? As with many things in our life, street art becomes one more Instagrammable object. However, this can give a certain robot-like effect to graffiti art, driving artists to subconsciously paint only for the photo. Painting becomes for the purpose of posting it, and artists forget about the actual lived experience. But while social media may have some downsides for the experience of creating art, perhaps the trade-off is not so bad. While the lack of anonymity now erases the scandalous mystique of graffiti, that doesn't seem essential to the core of the art form. Street artists were forced to be anonymous to avoid legal persecution. Now that graffiti laws aren't as strict anymore, they can share their work. Also, there is never going to be an artist who is completely free from external constraint. The artists today may have to rush to meet a commissioner's deadline, but in the past they also had to rush to finish their art before the police discovered them. To end this overly critical video off on a positive note, street artists are still finding ways to reclaim space and challenge commodification.
Let me just tell one other story story that I learned recently. There's a neighborhood school, Kensington Community School, and they got some funding a few years ago to do art on some of the private garages down the laneway that goes next to the school. And I just heard this story recently that apparently shortly after that was launched, somebody came along and tagged a bunch of the murals. But the artist who'd done the original work just took a bunch of photos and presented it and called it a collaboration. So kind of reclaimed the tagging work. So I think that when those kind of things happen, they happen in conjunction with really solidly community-based efforts that are connected to people in the neighborhood and not to extractive capitalist forces, then I'm excited about that. And I think that's the role that art can play in the community. When I talk about preserving the character of the neighborhood, it's that it's diverse, and there's people from all over the world, and they're small, and they're independent, and they're finding a foothold here. So what does art contribute to that? Well, again, to the extent that art is small and not owned by corporations, but done by people with their own voice, trying to create a vision and be part of a beautiful but small-scale, diverse neighborhood, I think that could be a really exciting partnership.
How you doing? Good. How's it going? The original motivation of my son's mom is basically from her. She's an artist. She does, clothing and murals and all different stuff. And she wanted to do the garage herself. And she's Nuu-chah-nulth from the West Coast, and so my son is First Nations as well. And so the original vision of it was some kind of indigenous imagery that would have reflected Talison's culture, right, on his mom's side. And it didn't work for circumstantial reasons, and so we came around again with Nick and a new inspiration and landed on Dungeons & Dragons, which also represents part of our culture, The D&D theme is awesome. I mean, we're D&D nerds, and this is Talison's game. And
I want to mention that my younger brother is a very serious D&D player, and he was excited that I was going to paint this mural. I want to throw that in there. Dan, that's good, man.
That's awesome. Our intention is to actually give Nick a model of like an indigenous representation of probably a killer whale. That's probably
what you're mentioning, yeah.
The best one to work with. And so it will have that echo, of the cultural connections.
I'm excited. And as a white dude, to be able to do anything with permission that's indigenous, it's a rad thing.
Street artists are still fighting to have an authentic voice. Let's support their fight and change how we see their work. Next time you're walking through an urban city, I encourage you to look around, pay attention to the extra space around you. What do you notice? You might be surprised out of your passivity. Clearly, something has changed. Hashtag art is life. Okay. Sorry.
This way or that way? Baldwin.
See you again. Bye. One, Chelsea, you guys go.